But I'd like to move perhaps back in time a little bit to December 26, 1980, the famous Rendlesham case.
Okay, we're looking at the thing. We're probably about 200 to 300 yards away. It looks like an eye winking at you. It's still moving from side to side. You know, like the pupil of an eye looking at you and winking. And the flash is so bright to the starscope that it almost burns your eye. Now we've got an object about 10 degrees directly south, 10 degrees off the horizon. And the ones in the north are moving, one's moving away from us. Hey, here he comes from the south. He's coming toward us now. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal.
Coming on board, even at the UFO desk or from the Ministry of Defense, had you, prior to this, had you heard about Rendlesham and the incident that happened there?
No, I hadn't.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only UFO case that I had heard of before I got this job, I mean, when I was put on that position, I had no knowledge or interest in this phenomenon, which is probably the way they wanted it, but also the best way to be. You don't want to come into a job like that encumbered with baggage, whether it's as a true believer or as a diehard debunker. The only case I'd ever heard of was probably Roswell, and so Rendlesham, no. Almost literally on day one in that job, one of the things I started to do was go back through the files that we had in our office. Obviously, there were files dating back to the Second World War that I looked at later. But there was one, sat there, and I pulled it out, and it said Rendlesham Forest, December 1980. And I was like, wait, what's this? And my predecessor, when I was taking the job, you have a handover, and he said, well, that's, I guess, the kind of crown jewels that it's the case nobody could explain. And so I'm leafing through, and I'm like, wait, what? The deputy base commander saw this as well? Wait, what's this what's this document on U.S. Air Force, letterhead saying that something landed? And wait, what's this about radioactivity levels at the landing site? And yeah, so the more I looked into it, the more bizarre it got.
And obviously, this was probably earlier in your time at the UFO desk then that you were looking into Rendlesham, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was aware of it almost from day one,
right?
Because it was part of the handover brief that I got from my predecessor. But as I went on in that job, we were still, for example, getting media inquiries about it. We were still getting members of parliament occasionally raising questions about it. And at a certain point, I thought, right, I need to do what cops would call a cold case review, go through the data that we have, see what we missed, and that's what I did.
A real X-file.
Yes, a real life X-file. And I use this analogy of police, and actually it's quite a good one, I think, because a UFO investigation has a lot of similarities with a police investigation, because the two strands of it are you identify and interview witnesses, and you secure and analyze evidence. And then it's almost like you've got a list of suspects. You know intellectually that most UFOs have conventional explanations. And so you try and think, well, what could it have been? And you check for aircraft, military exercises, satellites, meteors. And one by one, you eliminate those, or most times, of course, you don't. Most time you find a match, and you're like, okay, this is the explanation, or the likely explanation, whatever it might be. But the cases like Rendlesham, you go through all that and you still come up blank.
Okay. So after all the accumulated knowledge that you've had in, your years studying UFOs and the phenomenon, looking back at the investigation of Rendlesham, would you say that they did an adequate job investigating it? Or what would you have done in that position to give yourself a little bit more information, knowing what you know now about UFOs?
The investigation was completely mishandled for a number of reasons. And again, they are two things that often sabotage a police investigation. Two things that any cop will tell you if something goes wrong. These two things are usually the problem. The first was a jurisdictional dogfight. Basically, these were US bases on British soil. So you had this kind of, well, who's got jurisdiction, who's got primacy, some things the US military did, some things the British Ministry of Defense did, and allied to that, the second problem is poor information sharing. Again, just an unrelated example, but one of the lessons of 9/11 was that all sorts of intelligence agencies or parts of the government that had access to intelligence had intelligence but didn't share it. So FBI had something that CIA would have wanted to know, and vice versa. That happened with Rendlesham, that we had this kind of US government doing its thing, British government doing its thing. Everyone was kind of, secretive and holding their cards close to their chest or vest, whichever saying you use. And so a lot of things fell between the cracks. Oh, and delay. Because this happened over Christmas.
Right.
A lot of people were on leave. And it sounds like a silly thing, but actually, particularly back when I was doing this job, but particularly before this, Rendlesham 1980, before the internet and before email, before the 24/7 news cycle, before social media, the fact that something like this would happen over the Christmas break when a lot of key people were on leave was a much bigger deal than it might sound.
That is true. It's almost serendipitously done, almost maybe even deliberately during that time. A lot of these UFO cases and visitations are done in remote areas. They're rarely done in crowded places. And so it probably would make a little bit more sense that it would be done in a remote area, but also in, a time where there are less witnesses. However, what's interesting with Rendlesham is the people it involves. So Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, and obviously Deputy Base Commander Charles Halt. These were all active duty military personnel. Do you think that there is reason to believe that that was intentional, that this encounter somehow lent itself a little bit more to the narrative that there is some type of communication between military and UFOs?
Yes, I think so. And I'll directly quote Colonel Halt here. And I know all three of those people very well. And of course, I wrote a book with John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. But Colonel Halt, when he talks about seeing the UFO on the third of the 3 nights of activity, he talks about it zipping around in the sky like it was doing a grid search. But he says that at one point in the encounter, a beam of light came down and struck the ground in front of him and the half dozen or so people he'd taken out into the forest to investigate this. And he said, looking back on this, he said, was this a weapon? Was this a warning? Or was this communication? And he doesn't know the answer to that, but he said, well, whatever it was under intelligent control. And again, for this to happen right next to Bentwaters and Woodbridge, these 2 military bases separated by Rendlesham Forest, yes, it's remote, but these at the time were 2 of the most strategically important bases in the entire NATO military alliance. And this was a time, December 1980, when, and not a lot of people know this, but when we probably came closer to nuclear war than any other time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We, according to some military historians, we were very close, and this was because of what was going on in Poland with the trade union Solidarity. And there is intelligence that suggests that the Soviets had told the Polish government, you deal with this. If you don't deal with it, we will. And that they had a winter exercise regularly scheduled, which was a build-up of troops, and they practiced sort of transition to war. But there is intelligence that suggests that this time they were saying this exercise is going to turn into the real thing unless the situation in Poland is resolved. And Rendlesham Forest, of course, played itself out to this backstory. This was the geopolitical situation at the time.
Are there nuclear arms in that region?
We've hit one of those NCND moments. I can neither confirm nor deny.